if you talk about racial reconciliation,
Yeah.
if you talk about equality, if you even talk about diversity light in terms of let's have aesthetic variation, that's all fine, even in, far right Christian circles. It's when you start talking about justice. This is my church, my theology, and you didn't do it right. Until we diffuse that sense of, by default, this stuff is our territory, we'll never actually make real progress on racial justice.
One of the things, first off, I mean, I'm getting better.
Oh, there we are.
I'm getting better at, we got 3 cameras here. I'm getting better at this in-studio vibe because usually I kind of just roll into the conversation. Then people are like, well, who's your guest? Let me just, I'll do the official thing first. Dr. Jemar Tisby, it is truly an honor to have you in the studio with me. So
it's great to be here, and it's so cash. I didn't even know you started the cameras.
I know.
And
I'm
here
sneaky
I am,
like that.
chit-chatting. So you got hot mic comments.
It helps. It helps with like the overall. I think that just the flow of the conversation. We were talking earlier before we started recording about our style differences, because I feel like you're very put together, and I wear the same thing all the time. Like I don't know. I do so much work on the creative side where I feel like my brain has no space to think about what am I going to wear.
You're right.
So I just find the nearest pair of clothes. I just throw them on.
Well, it works for you because you're so darn charming.
Oh, thank you. That's so kind. This is a full circle moment because the first time you and I ever met, do you remember?
Vaguely. Was it in DC?
Well, yes, that's true. But the first time we ever spoke, I should say, I was running a different podcast.
Okay.
I'm kind of afraid to drop the name
memory, but
because it's still out there, and it was a different time in my life. We were amateurs.
Yeah.
But so I was not where I was today, but I was starting to have the questions around race and just those things. And we booked you, me and my co-host. His name is Rob, a good friend of mine still. And we had you on the podcast. I remember saying, dude, Jemar Tisby, he said yes to coming on the podcast. I can't believe it. And so we had you on. I mean, the image is so bad. It was on Zoom. It was nothing like this. It was before I started TNE.
What was the name of the podcast?
You're going to get out of me, huh? Okay. All right.
Yeah, come on.
I'm just warning people I was not who I am now. So I'm not sure all the things I said.
We'll talk about my story soon. So there's no
It was
shame.
called the Coffee, Theology, and Jesus podcast. It was an amateur podcast with me and some friends. And booking you was, I was like, I can't believe it because I read The Color of Compromise, and that book was one of the biggest changes of my life, giving me a new lens that I never had before when it came to the history of race in America, especially with the white evangelical church.
Yeah.
There are stories in there that still, when I recall them in my mind, make me tear up because I just never knew about them.
Yeah.
And this was shortly after or right around when the murder of Breonna Taylor happened and George Floyd happened. And I'm thinking to myself as a white evangelical, like, I don't have language, but something is wrong.
Right.
And I discovered your book and I was like, oh my gosh. So having you on the podcast then was crazy. And it's full circle now to have you in studio with New Evangelicals talking about your new book.
Well, listen.
The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance.
Thank you for having me. And don't despise small beginnings, right? It's iterative, right?
Yeah,
Everything that you do. And I can make a very cheesy tie-in to justice work too, right? Like we never get it right the first time we try.
Yeah.
But we try and we figure stuff out and we do it again and we get better each time. So I mean, this is in the setup you got now. Look at you now.
It's been a wild ride, man. I'm sure for you too. I mean, I feel like that book changed everything for you, Color of Compromise. I mean, it blew up. It was a New York Times bestseller.
Yeah. What's interesting is, sometimes what you get known for is not what you're actually focused on. You know what I mean?
Interesting.
So I had been doing racial justice work for years, publicly at least since 2011. And then The Color of Compromise comes out January 2019. A lot of people within Christian circles read it that year, but then it gets New York Times bestseller list in 2020. So a year and a half after it comes out, right? But I had this 8-year stretch before that book where I was in seminary. I was getting my PhD in history, but I wasn't known as a historian. I was known for what's now called The Witness, a Black Christian collective. And so I'm still trying to figure out, like, for folks who got introduced to me through that book, still trying to introduce them to the breadth of my work, which is broadly racial justice and not simply historian, although that's a foundation.
Well, what is your background? Did you grow up in like an evangelical space? I mean, what is that journey like?
So here's the thing. A lot of people of color just kind of find themselves in evangelical. It's not something we set out to do. It seems to be the case, you know?
Yes.
And it's often very relational. So for me, I was in high school. A friend of mine, a classmate of mine, was to this day a very, very, very good friend and a very faithful Christian. He's a pastor now. But he invited me to youth group. I didn't know anything about what it was. What I was a teenager in search of a community.
Yeah.
That's what it was. That's it.
Yeah.
And I had tried a lot of different. I wasn't the jock. I wasn't in the drama club. I wasn't the student government kid. I was like, where do I fit?
Yeah.
And it just so happened that this friend of mine invited me to the youth group, and they welcomed me. And that this is a realization I've only had in the past few years, that my passion for racial justice doesn't come out of having such horrible experiences of community. It comes out of having such positive experiences of community that I want to see more of, and I want to be even better. Because even though I felt like this youth group was a place where I felt socially accepted, it was still, to the extent that there was a barrier, it was race. And so, one of my kind of internal guideposts is I want to reduce racism as a barrier to authentic inclusion and identity. So what would it be like if our youth groups, if our churches, if our nonprofits, if our families, if our communities, we could bring our full selves into those communities and be ourselves, not in a colorblind way. I don't see color. I want you to see me. I want you to see all of me.
Right.
And I want you to understand that's part of who I am. And it doesn't need to be sidelined or shunned or pretended as if it's invisible, but it should be approached with curiosity, empathy, understanding, and even celebration.
Okay.
I'm already getting preachy. My apologies.
No, preach. I love it. It's important. So you found a home there. How long were you kind of in that space? I mean,
all through high school. Well, I guess I joined up maybe sophomore year-ish, maybe early junior year-ish. And then I became part of the leadership team. So it was a classic evangelical conversion.
Yes.
We were at a youth retreat. They kind of cornered me in one of the cabins and they're like, all right, you've heard the gospel. Right. You in or you out.
Right. Put up or shut up.
Say the sinner's prayer. All of that.
Yeah.
But it stuck.
Sure.
And so, I kept going and then pretty quickly became one of the student leaders of that youth group. And then I go to college. And that's at the University of Notre Dame.
Wow.
And one of the reasons I chose Notre Dame was because it was Catholic. I was Protestant, but I had gone to Catholic school K through 8, so I was familiar with that.
Yeah.
But it was also a place that was, in a sense, pretty serious about religion, such that you could hear God talk just around campus, and you didn't have to be in some special group. You didn't have to be in InterVarsity or Crew or whatever it was. You could literally be on the sidewalk or in class. There are crucifixes at the front of the class. Some professors prayed before class. There's a chapel in a lot of the dorms. It was just kind of in the atmosphere. And I wanted a place where religion felt organic to the place and not, inserted or extraneous there. But that was a whole new challenge going to college.
I'm kind of curious, what flavor of evangelicalism did you end up in? Because you have like your John MacArthur reform types. I mean, listen, I grew up listening to Paul Washer sermons. I want to take my faith incredibly seriously. But there's that famous sermon that he did where he's talking to a youth group and he says, he says something about like, we need Christians who want the true gospel and who aren't lukewarm. And everyone claps and he goes, I don't know why you're clapping. I'm talking to you. It's like a mic drop moment. I'm like, Paul Washer, right? So
Keep it on us.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So there's that side. Then there's the more charismatic side, and then some of those people. Where were you?
This was 90s style, seeker sensitive.
Okay.
Willow Creek evangelicalism.
Okay.
So when I went to the church that was associated with this youth group, it was very topical sermons, very, Rick Warren-esque type of stuff. So it was kind of this mainstream white bread evangelicalism. It wasn't an extreme on either side. Yeah.
Did you find yourself migrating as you got older into any particular space?
Yeah. So when I was in college, I got this book called Desiring God.
Oh, I've heard of that somewhere.
By John Piper.
Oh, yeah, classic.
And that was my introduction into Reformed theology. I didn't know it was called that at that point.
Yeah.
But what I noticed was, there's a lot of Bible in here.
Yes.
There's a lot of scripture in here. And it scratched this intellectual itch I had to understand the Bible. And I was so naive at this point. There's different branches even in Reformed theology.
Yes.
And so I was so naive at this point that I opened up the phone book. This is in the day before smartphones, right? And I go to the yellow pages, and my very sophisticated strategy for finding a church was looking for any church that had Reformed in the title. And there was only one, and it was a Dutch Reformed church.
Oh, okay.
So I end up going to this CRC church, Christian Reformed Church, and everybody's white. Like, I'm used to being a minority, one of a few. Everybody's white. I'm the only one. And I didn't know this, but the Dutch run tall, apparently. That's a thing.
Okay.
And so I'm black, I'm short, I'm in this Dutch Reformed congregation, and I could not have felt more out of place. But it was also the first place where I got this, what they call expositional preaching, right?
Yeah.
Verse by verse through books of the Bible.
Yeah.
So again, scratching that intellectual itch I had for theology and understanding the Bible more.
Wow. Okay. So you're there, but you're not there anymore. So I want to kind of just flesh out this story for you, because it's interesting. You and I have some overlap in our own ways, because I know that sense of I want to know scripture deeply, and that world at least presents that way, right? We take the Bible seriously. We want to go into the context and preach verse by verse. And I had that itch too. I wanted to take my faith incredibly seriously. And I also found myself in some kind of reform world for a lot of years. But for you, especially, being, like you just said, the only black person at this church, et cetera, did you always kind of have a sense of but there's this other element that no one's talking about in this space,
always,
that is part of my experience that has no connection to the broader scheme here?
Yep. So race was always sort of part of my story. It was at least in the back of my mind, because always going back to high school, right? Even something as simple as the dating scene. There's almost no black women in these spaces in my high school youth group, right? So then, you're thinking through relationships, you're thinking through friendships. So it was always there in the back of my mind. Then when I get exposed to this Reformed theology, and then deeper into it, the gospel coalitions, the Desiring God websites, the online stuff, right? I'm saying it's like all white people. And so I remember distinctly finding a book called On Being Black and Reformed by a pastor in Georgia named Tony Carter.
Okay.
And I was like, okay, so there's at least one other one. And that was a doorway into, there's this very tiny strain of black people, mostly black men. There's some patriarchy and sexism here, that at least clued me into there's a lane. And what's so interesting is there have been iterations of reformed black organizations trying to articulate, priorities around race and racial justice that have all, risen and fizzled out and risen and fizzled out. So it was this constant push to try to say, hey, we're here.
You're saying in the American evangelical context over the decades,
but specifically in the 21st century, in the 2000s, right? When you get these ministries that are explicitly reformed leaning,
right,
coming up, there's always some small group of black people trying to organize and say, we're here. Can we address these topics and these issues?
Okay, this is actually really important, and an important thread to pull out, because I also read the Desiring God. I was TGC, the Gospel Coalition, a staple website to go to, right? of course, I'm not black, right? I'm white.
Wait a minute, what?
Yeah, I know.
What am I doing on the show?
Real shocker alert, I know. But yeah, okay, so this is so fascinating to me. So essentially what I'm hearing you say is that, hey, there have been groups of black Americans who are reformed. Inerrancy, penal substitutionary atonement, would have all the right theological convictions as their white counterparts.
Yeah.
While also saying, hey, on top of that, can we also take serious this racial experience that I have that's different than yours?
100%.
And what was the reaction to those requests in your experience?
So the groups were never big, so never had that much clout, right? It was mostly appealing to and serving other black people, which there was a need for.
Yeah.
Here's the thing, Tim. There's a way to talk about race in predominantly white Christian circles that's uncontroversial.
Yep.
If you talk about racial reconciliation,
Yeah.
if you talk about equality, if you even talk about diversity light in terms of let's have aesthetic variation.
Right. Yes.
That's all fine, even in, far right Christian circles. It's when you start talking about justice. So here's the more interesting part to me.
Yeah, tell me.
I switched from using the term racial reconciliation to racial justice
Okay.
because I had, for over a decade, probably early 2000s up to the early 2010s, been on this racial reconciliation track and saying, the primary thing I'm saying is we need more multi-ethnic churches.
Right.
Which there's been an explosion of. And
Yes.
I can go down rabbit holes around the history of that, but we're actually living, I think, in a unique period of church history where intentionally multi-ethnic, multiracial churches are actually celebrated and not, automatically dismissed out of hand. And to this day, that tends to be the case. But in my experience, and there are other pastors and members of multi-ethnic churches who will differ, but in my experience, much of that culture was still white evangelical. And all we were doing was putting, as I say, different hues in the pews.
Oh, that's good.
Different hues in the
Different
pews.
hues in the pews.
But,
Wow.
But they tended to want our presence, but not our perspective, in the sense of they didn't want to shift priorities. So when I switched from racial reconciliation, I still think reconciliation is a Bible word. I don't have any problem with people using that term, racial reconciliation, but it depends on what you mean.
Yeah.
If by racial reconciliation you mean people of color coming into white spaces and assimilating to the norm,
Right.
then what use is it?
Right.
I shifted from using racial reconciliation to racial justice because that's about equity. This is about power shifting and power sharing.
Oh, you're using a lot of trigger words now.
Yeah, exactly.
Equity, power shifting. Okay.
Yeah. So this is about within churches and Christian groups, of course, sharing power. So it should, your congregation, your ecclesiology, your way of doing church should shift depending on who you have there, because you're serving them in ways that are tailored to where they are and what their issues and what their priorities and what their problems are. If it doesn't, then are you really diverse in ways that are meaningful? So that's one aspect. But also more broadly, what happens in church on Sunday for a couple hours is just one tiny part of life.
Right.
So what does justice look like broadly in society when we're talking about race? And so I wanted to address comprehensively all of those things, because I think all of that in the church and beyond is part of the Christian call to justice.
Okay. Let me just say, that makes complete sense to me. That doesn't sound controversial to me. I think it's totally biblical, dare I use that phrase, right? So you're advocating for this. People like yourself are advocating for this. What was the response you got as you started changing your vocabulary and saying, listen, like, I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad that we seem like we're all on the same page. Let me help you out with some of this stuff, because we want the same things. We have the same theological convictions, right? This is completely compatible with that. What's the response?
At first, it was welcoming. It was embracing. So I remember I was part of the Presbyterian Church in America, which has roots in Southern Presbyterianism. Anytime you hear that word Southern before a Christian denomination, it means pro-slavery.
Right.
So they broke off.
Southern Baptist Convention, right? Yeah, exactly. Right.
So they have, deep connections with Southern Presbyterianism, which is to say this was white, it's very conservative, et cetera, et cetera. But I was presenting at their national annual convention, like a workshop on race and things like that. I was presenting at the Gospel Coalition Desiring God conferences, right? Talking about race from a reform perspective, because to them at that point, it was, okay, here's our thing, reform theology. And we've kind of sprinkled some racial diversity stuff in here. That's a good thing. Okay. Then it starts getting really dicey. There's rumblings. So number one, when I go public, so it's at that time called the Reformed African American Network. This is how deep I'm into it, right?
Wow,
We're going to call it Reformed African American Network.
Right.
So I start talking publicly. We start a website, so we're publishing blogs. Then we start our podcast, Pass the Mic, which is still going to this day. And now it becomes a problem because our voices are louder in these circles.
Right.
Now we might, start having an impact, right? Now the influence is spreading.
Right.
Then here's the real kicker. When stuff starts to hit the fan is, I thought it was like race and religion. That was the trigger.
Right.
That coupling. Really, it's a trio. Race, religion, politics. So 2015 is where it gets interesting.
Interesting. That's the rise of Trump, obviously, is coming up, right? So you're in that space in 2015.
Yes.
And your voice is getting louder.
Yes.
There's more influence happening. I'm curious, was the D word thrown your way? Like, oh, you're being divisive?
Oh, a ton. This is going back a little bit, but I remember really memory that stands out to me is I preached in Oxford, Mississippi, which is where the University of Mississippi is.
So not Oxford.
Not the English Oxford.
Okay.
Oxford, Mississippi. And I was at this PCA church, and it was a very lightweight racial reconciliation message. And after the sermon, people come up and talk to you and whatnot. And so there was this angry white man. I mean, like trembling with rage. And he's way taller than me. He gets in my face. He's towering over me. Mind you, this is in the church sanctuary, a bunch of people milling around. And this is part of the obliviousness of white people. Do not invite a speaker, particularly a person of color and or a woman, without buffer and protection and somebody there, even just to move people along, right?
Right.
So I was feeling very vulnerable in this moment.
Totally.
And he just berates me. He lays into me. You didn't mention the gospel not once. You didn't mention Jesus not once. And I'm following all the rules, right? I'm in seminary at this point, and I am going, 3-point sermon, exposition, illustration. It's by the book.
Right.
So he's not even right. But the fact that I was talking about race
right.
in his church, this is the piece. All right, ownership. Can we talk about that?
Yes.
There's a sense in which white people, by default, you can diffuse this by consciously thinking of it, but by default, many white people tend to think this is their space.
Yes.
That can be an ideological space, an educational space, a physical space. You remember the Birmingham boat brawl?
Mm-hmm. I do.
It was this group of white people on a boat who didn't want to listen to a black worker telling them, you can't park here.
Right.
And what's underlying that? This is our space.
Right.
You can't tell us what to do.
Yeah.
It's the same oftentimes in churches, in seminaries. The thing is, that man who came up to me after this is my church, my theology, and you didn't do it right. Until we diffuse that sense of, by default, this stuff is our territory, we'll never actually make real progress on racial justice.
Can I ask you a personal question? You don't have to answer it, but can edit it out, just to be clear. But I'm sure you saw, that story is one of, I'm sure, many examples that you saw while in those spaces. What made you stick around? What was it that made you go, but I think maybe we can still be the change that we want to see?
It's simple.
Tell me.
Jesus. All this racism never once made me think, well, maybe Christianity isn't true. Never once. Number one, because I had some exposure to the black church, and I knew there was a different way to do it. I spent 4 years at this rural black missionary Baptist church in Arkansas and in the Delta. And the average age was like 65. And there's no, band, no formal choir. It's all a cappella. We had metal folding chairs. We met in a bus depot with exposed cement floors, right? It was the most simple, bare bones, basic church. But there was a deep, rich, historically rooted, Jesus-centered theology there, right?
Yes.
So it's like whatever like this reformed white evangelical space is like pouring out, that's not the only way to think about the faith. And now I did leave some of those circles eventually. So I didn't
Did
stick
you leave
around
or
those
were you
communities.
kicked out? How did that work?
So what I say is, if you remain in predominantly white Christian circles and you continue to talk about racial justice, you're either pushed out, burned out, or sell out.
Oof.
You're pushed out, you're burned out, or you sell out.
So when did you leave?
Leave/pushed out.
Yeah.
2016 was when I finally had no formal ties to any reformed or evangelical spaces.
Did the whole rise of Trump, the massive white evangelical support of Trump, for you, was that a shocking moment, or was it like, nah, man, this is the fruit of what I've been seeing for a long time? Because to me, being a white evangelical at that time who had no, I mean, dude, my lens for this was still on the table. I mean, I might have saw it from afar, but I had no clue what it was, right? Trump to me in that moment was shocking. I was flabbergasted. I could not believe that my tradition, who taught me these sexual purity values and these other values of integrity, were like, no, vote for the guy who's grabbing women. So to me, it was shocking.
Right.
But I'm curious from your vantage point, how you were reading that.
I don't think anybody is being honest if they say they weren't shocked at all.
Okay.
Because even the polling said right up until the election that Hillary had the edge, right? So I think even just from an electoral standpoint, it was, and there was a field of like 24 Republican candidates for president. Right. Like, so seeing
I liked
that.
John Kasich at the time. I'm like, John seems nice. He seems, it's typical.
For those days. Yeah.
For those days.
Wow.
Right.
So I think there was a little bit level of a shock to the system, broadly speaking. But what gave me pause?
Yeah.
I had been embedded in white evangelical circles for most of my life at that point. And throughout it, becoming increasingly vocal about racial reconciliation, racial justice, to mostly receptive or at least curious audiences. And what gave me pause was when that number, that 81% of white evangelicals who voted had pulled the lever for Trump.
Yeah.
That felt like a betrayal. It made me feel like, what is all this work for?
Yeah.
What impact has any of this had if when it really comes to the moment of truth and who's going to be president and who's going to lead this country politically, everything that we've been saying as black people, as other people of color, has gone out the window, gone by the wayside, and you still vote for your own interests. So one of the big turning points for me was the day after the election. I recorded a podcast, and our podcast producer was asking me questions. And we were talking about church that Sunday. Election's on a Tuesday. We're talking on Wednesday. Church is coming Sunday. I'm a member of a predominantly white evangelical church at that point. And I said, I don't feel safe worshiping at my church this Sunday.
Wow.
And I didn't mean I didn't feel physically safe or anything, but I didn't feel emotionally or spiritually safe because I knew there were some people in our congregation who were rejoicing.
Thrilled.
Doing a happy dance that Trump won. And these are people I sang with, prayed with, had dinner with. They'd held my child in their arms. And I'm like, but you don't know me at all.
Right.
And here's the definition of a blind spot. Like if you're driving, you don't see what you don't see. And therefore, you change lanes, you make a move, you could actually cause incredible harm, incredible damage. And I don't attribute any kind of motives or whatever. I don't know what they were thinking. But it was a blind spot to them to where their actions caused immense harm because we as black people were in their white evangelical blind spot.
Is that because The Color of Compromise came out in 2019?
Yeah.
Is that whole situation what gave you the inspiration to write that book?
No, that was through coursework in grad school.
Okay.
Namely.
So were you always into history, and like was this kind of always your thing even when you were in those reform circles? Were you kind of always into like unpacking just American history and then finding your focus?
Looking back, I can connect the dots. That's the great thing about history. Everything's clear in hindsight.
It really is crystal clear, you know? Yeah.
So yeah, back in college, I had a concentration in history. I was American studies, but I had a concentration within that in history. And I remember really being interested in those classes on history, but it was never on my radar to get a PhD in it or to pursue it. And here's how I got into it. It's tied into white evangelicalism. So a lot of people don't realize, but I was for a semester enrolled in a PhD program at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary.
Isn't that where Al Mohler?
That's where Al Mohler
my
is.
Goodness, where Al
There's a
Mohler
whole
is.
story there.
Jeez Louise, dude.
But
Talk about the belly of the beast.
you know, yeah.
I mean, he shook hands with Doug Wilson a couple weeks ago.
I was in Al Mohler's house on a tour. You know, this is a whole story there.
I'm cringing for you.
So this is still back 2016-ish, 2015,
yeah.
2016 area.
Yeah.
And what got me into history was I was in this modular PhD program through SBTS, and they did not, I wanted to do something on, you know, black church, black
Right,
Christianity.
yeah.
They didn't have the resources, either in the professors or the library resource. So I had to take a class at Jackson State University. I was living in Jackson at the time, and it's a historically black college. And I took a master's level history course, and I was hooked.
You're hooked.
It was the only class that I can remember I ever read all the books ahead of time. I was just so in it, and I'm probably in my 30s at this point, going back to school, and this is black history I never learned. Just never knew about.
You know, my head is spinning because it's so not often I get such amazing people like yourself in that seat. And so, I have 1,000 different questions and ways that we can go. One of the questions I want to ask you, because we have so much history to get into, especially with the book, The Spirit of Justice, which is out now. I want to talk about that with you and some of the stories that you picked and why you picked them. So we're going to do that. I'm curious, though, as a historian, knowing what you know now, is Trump a surprise now? Like knowing the history, knowing kind of the cycles that you've seen as a historian, here's my opinion. I'll leave it to you to judge. I think that Trump is simply the fruit of decades of the moral majority laying down the foundation of these systems, spaces, theology, worldviews, politics, along with talk radio, that have given us the fruit of Trump. So now I'm not surprised,
Right.
But in that moment I was surprised.
Yep.
As a historian, how do you read that?
Everyone should study history because history shows you the pattern. Historians can't predict the future, but what we get really good at is seeing patterns.
Yeah.
So the pattern is racial advancement, white backlash. Racial advancement, white backlash, right? So, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates does a great job of basically writing about how Trump is a response and a backlash to Obama as the first black president.
Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yep.
Because you can go all the way back to, you know, the Nat Turner revolt in the early 1800s. And then as a result, there are harsher slave codes. There are harsher laws in place about black people gathering. You can go to post-Civil War and post-emancipation. You have this brief period of Reconstruction. And then you have this white backlash in the form of Jim Crow. The entire Jim Crow era is essentially an attempt to reestablish white supremacy after race-based chattel slavery is abolished in the 13th Amendment.
Is this also when the Tulsa massacre happens as well, Black Wall Street?
Yeah, so you could really think of the Jim Crow era as 1877 to, depending on when you want to stop, 1954, Brown v. Board kind of a thing.
Okay, wait, pause. I'm sorry. I did not know it was that long of a space.
Yeah.
In my head, it's like 20 years.
Right.
No,
Yeah.
You're saying it's much bigger than that, the Jim Crow era.
Yes. Because what they did, and this is what we're seeing now, patterns, they took over the democratic apparatus and made it minority rule.
Wait, pause. Okay, hold on. You can't do this to me. You can't drop these bombs. Wait a second. Unpack that for me.
So the way that Jim Crow lasts for half a century plus is right after the Civil War, black men get the franchise. They get the right to vote through the 15th Amendment, 1870, right? And so you have this flowering of black political participation. Now, women aren't able to vote at this point, but you have, the first black senators, the first black state reps and congresspeople, all of that.
Ever.
And
so access to political power is happening for the first time.
Yep. And black people are getting information. They're electing leaders who represent them. And then what happens kind of state by state, community by community is new political actors, white supremacist political actors come on the scene and they start changing the rules. So for example, Mississippi Constitution of 1890 was a complete rewrite of the Constitution, which they had just rewritten as a condition for entry back into the Union after the Civil War. And when they rewrote that Constitution, they made it, they did the poll taxes, they did the literacy tests, they made everything, they set up everything in the Constitution, democratic processes, to exclude black political participation. That persisted for decades. We just came off the Democratic National Convention. 1964, DNC, Fannie Lou Hamer spoke. She was part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that was trying to unseat the all-white delegation from Mississippi. The Constitution and the political machine in Mississippi, as just one example, this is happening all over the country, was so complete that from the 1890s to the 1960s, black people couldn't get a toe in politically in the state.
That's 60 years. That's at least a full generation of people could not even get a foot in the door because of how the Constitution was rewritten when white supremacists essentially got in power.
Exactly. How the Constitution was rewritten, how they mapped out the counties. So Mississippi has or had around 80 counties. It only has a population of 3 million total. There's no reason to have that many darn counties. Why do you do that? Politically, it's harder to gain a majority when you're doing county by county elections, and you can split them up into these tiny white rural communities.
Okay, so is this what people talk about when they use terms like gerrymandering or redistricting?
Exactly.
These are the same tactics that we hear about today that were being used back then to maintain
these are Jim Crow
or to reinforce a white supremacist outlet, right? Well, and to be clear, what we're talking about is a place where non-white people are disenfranchised to have access to the same political power as their counterpart as far as it being a U.S. citizen.
And two things to remember here. Number one, Mississippi has the highest proportion of black people of any state in the Union. Nearly 40% of the population is black. That's not a coincidence in terms of the political repression. So the more black people there are, the more concentrated numbers of black people, the harder these forces of backlash push to contain that power. The second thing to remember is this is a white elite movement. They are willing to throw poor white people under the bus to maintain this kind of power. So the literacy tests and the poll taxes, those also catch poor white folks up too.
Right.
But as long as the middle class and especially the wealthy class of white people stays in power, it can go to the law schools, can get the government positions, they'll sacrifice a few of their own.
Now,
happening to this day.
Right. Well, I mean, okay, so you mentioned earlier that this was the Democratic Party at the time. Now, obviously, things have changed, right? Can you just, I don't need the full detail, but essentially, a long story short, these parties switched?
Yes. There's a party realignment.
I'm sure you see the guy on Twitter, well, the Democrats were the party of slavery. It's like, debunk that for us, please.
Here's the universal lesson. These folks who want to claim that, the Republican Party is the party of freedom because that was the party of Lincoln back in the 1860s.
Yes, right? I hear this all the time.
These are historically unserious people. They do not take accurate history seriously. Yeah. They'll take a mythologized, propagandized history that is valorous of the United States, this constant progression from, one freedom to the next.
Right.
They won't actually look into the academic history, which, by the way, here's the difference between the pop history that you see on a lot of bookshelves and academic history.
Yeah, tell me.
Academic history is subject to peer review. when we write something, when we publish something, other experts in our field look over it, oftentimes try to tear it apart, but it's got to pass muster. There's some guardrails, and there's a history. Being a historian is an actual profession with standards, right?
Right.
So you can trust the accuracy of the data. And then here's another bonus tidbit for you.
Please.
There's no such thing as objective history.
Okay.
There's no such thing as objective history. There are the raw data and the primary sources. But every time someone tries to interpret history, it's just that. It's a work of interpretation. And actually, that's the most interesting history. What historians do is take a set of data and facts and say, here's my take on it. Here's my thesis. And here's the supporting evidence, just like they taught you in school. What propagandists do is say, here's my take, and it's basically just my opinion. I'm going to throw some random facts in there, but when you add them up, they actually don't build a strong case for what I'm arguing.
Okay, this is helpful because, this is an important piece to kind of, I think, flesh out just for a second here. I noticed that some of these far right spaces have their historians. Barton, is it David Barton? Right, is one of them. Right?
You have a barf bag here. I'm just a
but
bucket.
He's one of them. And I've seen him before. My understanding is that he has no degree in history. Nope. He's not a historian at all. But he gets touted around as like giving the true history of the U.S. But what you're saying is the difference is that this guy he's not even really a pop historian. He's just someone who has spun a narrative that sounds convincing to people who have a dogmatic approach of like, this is how it must have been.
Yeah.
So you'll spin the narrative. What you're saying is that people like yourself, actual historians, you, Christian Dumais, others, you have other peers who will not hold back critiquing your work and saying, Jamar, actually, you really missed this here, and here's why.
Yo, look, if you haven't had the sweaty palms and the butterfly in your stomach when you go to defend your dissertation from a committee of experts who, even being for you, can rip your work apart, right?
Yeah.
Then you haven't subjected your own work to the rigor it requires to put that out there, right? So, yeah, the Bible talks about, giving people what their itching ears want to hear.
Yeah.
That's what these propagandists and pop culture historians are doing. People want a certain narrative. They want to believe a certain story about history, about the United States. These people are giving them what they want. Accuracy be damned.
Okay, now I have to play devil's advocate for a second, if I'm allowed.
Yeah.
You mentioned that it's not a history it's not objective, is what you said. Something to that effect,
Yes.
because everyone's giving interpretation.
Yes.
So what's the difference then, right? Could someone say, well, Jamar,
Absolutely.
Look,
Please do.
just your opinion here. It's not objective. How do you respond to that? Like, what's the difference between a Barton type and someone like yourself when you tell history?
Make your case. Make your case. You put up your thesis, muster your data and your facts to support it. I'll put up my thesis. We'll muster data and facts to support it, and we'll compare and say whose case is stronger. That's all historians do, and we build off of one another, right? But the difference is, I think, even in the color of compromise, which I say in the introduction is quote unquote selective history. What I do is, through a historical survey, make the case that by and large, white Christians compromised and were complicit with racism rather than confronting it.
Right.
Now, you can argue that that's not the case, but you got to bring a case that's stronger than mine.
Right.
And the reality is, the data and the facts of history support
Right.
far more white Christians kowtowing or retreating from confronting racism than those who actually did.
Well, I think even about J. Russell Hawkins' book, the Bible Told Them So. Another book, a historian. 25% of it is just his notes.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's, again, like it makes a strong case,
Yes.
right? And so you're right. I think when you start comparing even just the amount of literature on these topics and then how well sourced all of them are, you can start to kind of see where we're actually heading and which side, which perspective we should say, might have a stronger case rooted in some kind of data.
And to bring it, not everybody has the time to go deep into the historical sources.
That's why I bring people like you on.
Sources, right? So, I mean, for folks listening,
right.
you don't have to do this, but just have some awareness about trustworthy voices, right? Like people who do have PhDs from actual universities, at the very minimum, you knew they stood in front of a panel of experts and had to defend their ideas and make their case, right? Academic presses, historical writing is getting better. It has this whole terrible reputation of being dry as dust, inaccessible, and there's some of that still out there.
Sure.
But you go to a University of North Carolina press, an Oxford press, a University of Mississippi press, whatever it is, those ones are academic books by academic historians, and some are really, really compelling and readable, right? Like, I can name a plethora of people, but I mean, just look in the end notes of any of my books, and they're there.
Okay, that's really helpful. So let's kind of come back now. I asked you about the Trump thing, the history. You mentioned that there are these patterns, and there's like progress, and then there's like this white backlash, right? So you, as a historian, you see these patterns happening since the beginning of our foundation as a country. And then how do you use those examples to help you better understand the present moment?
Well, number one, you want to talk about backlash. 2020 is truly historic racial justice uprisings. Historic in the volume, the number of people participating, the breadth of cities. It was even international. So the size of it was historic. The other thing that was historic about the 2020 uprisings were how multiracial they were. You had many marches and protests that were majority white, and people in places like the Pacific Northwest where there ain't hardly any black people, right?
Right.
And they're marching for Black Lives Matter. That's historic, right?
Right.
No sooner do you have these historic racial justice uprisings than the calendar changes. And on January 6th, 2021, you get one of the biggest backlashes to racial progress in U.S. history, an attempted insurrection, where somebody's parading a Confederate flag in the U.S. Capitol building, something that even the Confederates during the Civil War weren't able to accomplish. So yeah, we see this pattern happening right now, and that's just one day. The broader backlash is anti-DEI, anti-CRT, Supreme Court rolling back affirmative action provisions, all of these things that are happening to suppress racial justice and racial progress, I think are in large part a reaction and a response to unprecedented support for racial justice for about 2 seconds in 2020.
Well, you mentioned when I picked you up from the airport yesterday, we were eating some wonderful Philly cheesesteaks. They were so good. But you mentioned to me kind of in passing, I was like, wait, I don't understand. You mentioned how even for you, like speaking engagements at a lot of colleges, like they've gone quiet, how books on race, they had this huge explosion, right? And then they've kind of gone stagnant. Yeah. Is that part of that as well that you're seeing?
Big time. This is what I need people to understand. There's always going to be the extreme voices, right? And they're typically the loudest, and they typically shape the conversation.
Yep.
But there's always, they're a minority number-wise, right? So if you look at something like white Christian nationalism, the polling, particularly from the Public Religion Research Institute, says, first of all, white Christian nationalism is not a binary, like you are or you aren't. It's a spectrum.
Yeah.
So there's a spectrum on the right that is ambassadors.
Yep.
And just to the left of them are accommodators.
Yep.
So the ambassadors are the ones who storm a Capitol on January 6th.
Yep.
They're the ones like Marjorie Taylor Greene saying, I'm a Christian nationalist and I'm proud, right?
That's right. That's your Charlie Kirks of the world.
Yes. Statistically, about 10% of the population.
Yeah, right.
The accommodators are 19%. And so, here's the thing, politically, they all vote the same.
Exactly.
So you got about 30% of the population there, right?
Yep.
So, but I want to talk about that 19%. That's what's happening in many Christian circles. So it's not necessarily that all predominantly white Christian circles, whether churches or universities or whatever, are part of that ambassador crowd, that extreme far-right crowd.
Yep.
They're in the mushy middle.
Yep.
Numerically, they're a much bigger group, but they're scared by the right. They're so scared that I recently had a conversation on text message with a professor friend of mine. He was asking about something else, but I said, oh, hey, by the way, I've got this new book, The Spirit of Justice, coming out. You think, we could have a conversation on campus about it? And he's like, you know what, man, I love your book. I think the topic and the content is great. But right now, the climate, this kind of book would just be too controversial. Wow. I could never get it past administration.
I mean, literally, the book is called The Spirit of Justice. The subtext, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. What is so controversial about a book that tells the history of people's faith journey and stories of resistance?
Well, part of it's me. I've become radioactive in some circles.
You become the lightning rod.
Yes,
huh?
exactly. The convenient scapegoat where if you mention my name in some circles, that's an automatic, no or rejection. But more broadly speaking, it's these Christian colleges and universities, even a lot of churches, that are afraid not of the content of the book, but of what people further to the right will say about having a conversation about the content of the book. So they're afraid of being labeled woke or leftist or promoting critical race theory or, succumbing to a DEI ideology, whatever that is, right?
Right, whatever that is.
That's what they're afraid of. So one of the things is when you talk about this work, it don't pay. It's so funny. Online, they'll talk about racial grifters.
Yeah.
And the reality is the grifters are the far right who are making tens of thousands of dollars, writing New York Times bestsellers, bashing people like me who are working for racial justice. Meanwhile, books like mine can barely see the light of day, can barely get the attention of publishers or purchasers, right? So where's the real grift happening?
Right.
They're always accusing other people of what they're doing.
Right.
Anyway, most of my speaking gigs used to come from Christian colleges and universities.
Wow.
Now that's almost completely dried up.
Wow.
And I think not because these colleges and universities are opposed to racial justice.
Right.
I think they have pressure from the public, from trustees, from donors, not to get into these conversations for fear of being labeled too liberal.
It makes me so angry to see that far right world, right? Like, I'm just going to name names. I always do this. You have your Charlie Kirks, your Ali Stuckies, your Meg Bashams now. I mean, there's this group of people that just seem to stir the pot in the most disingenuous ways possible. Even folks like Elisa Childers now, same kind of on that same trajectory. And those people have big audiences. And those big audiences have connections to those places. And that's how the ripple effect works. And frankly, I see your name mentioned along with folks like the big three are like you, David French, and Russell Moore. I saw someone on Twitter with a straight face say that Russell Moore's a progressive Christian. Wow. I almost spit out my drink. Like, I've talked to Russell Moore. He's been on the show 2 times. Very nice guy. In fact, I like a lot of his work. But him and I have massive disagreements on many serious issues that would keep him very far from the term progressive Christianity.
On any scale you put him on.
On any scale.
Absolutely.
So it is so frustrating to watch them redefine terms, draw attention to folks like you, and then folks like you suffer because of their propaganda.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Can I talk about white Christian nationalism for a second?
Can you ever? Right. Yes.
So
of course you can.
I have this very highfalutin sounding definition, but I'll break it down.
All right.
White Christian nationalism is an ethnocultural ideology that uses Christian symbolism as a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control.
Whew.
All right.
Right.
It's sections in there.
Yeah.
Right.
Help me out.
So it's ethnocultural.
Yeah.
That means it's racial. In the United States, it shows up as a white, racially centered movement. But you'll also hear talk about Western civilization.
All the time.
And
we have to protect Western civilization. Yes.
And Western civilization has brought civilization to the world. It has contributed more to the world than any other culture or civilization, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So all of that's part of the ethnocentric idea. And the example I always put forth that hasn't gained traction that I wanted it to yet is, when Marvel Comics wanted to come up with the opposition to Nazi Germany, who did they come up with? Captain America.
Yeah.
And what does Captain America look like? He's not a woman. He's not a person of color. He's not disabled.
Nope.
It is a white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, big man. That is
Yes.
the quintessential America. You can
And
look
the
at
person they casted for him fits that description.
It's that
Chris
description,
Evans, right?
That's no shade to Chris Evans. Yeah. And by the way, the one time I could find a reference to God in all the Avenger movies is Chris Evans, Captain America, saying, "There's only one God, man."
That's
And
right.
It doesn't look like that.
That's right.
This is like white Christian nationalism coming in.
Wow. Don't ruin Marvel for me, okay? I'm just kidding.
No, Chris Evans did a fantastic job in that. And if you watch this,
yeah, right. Thumbs up. Come on the show.
Yeah.
But no, that is a great point. Okay.
Yeah, so that's a quintessence. So it's, I always say white Christian nationalism. You're going to hear most people say Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
They're scared of saying the racial part out loud, even though it's embedded in there. Ethnocultural. It's an ideology. That's what made me think of it, is when we were talking about, these narratives that people are buying into. An ideology is more on feelings and belonging than facts and data. This is why you can't argue down a white Christian nationalist. You can stack books and articles from floor to ceiling and it won't make a dent, because why are they subscribing to this? They get a sense of identity and belonging from it. It goes way deeper than the intellectual, right? And then it uses Christian symbolism. Here's the thing. People say white Christian nationalism isn't Christian. No, it's not, in the sense that it's not the way of Jesus. But here's the thing. If you were to look at it from the outside, these people pray, they read the Bible, they go to church, they pray before meals, whatever it is, right?
They probably affirm the creed.
They affirm the creeds, right? So, I mean, what's the definition here?
Thank you. Yes.
And the reason why I say, whether you agree that it's quote unquote Christian or not, these are people who claim to be Christian.
Totally.
So you got to deal with them.
You got to deal with
It's
them.
nobody else's problem primarily.
Nothing drives me crazier than when folks say they're not real Christians. I'm like, listen, maybe they're antichrist in nature, but they are picking up a Christian tradition.
They're in these
right?
churches.
And when we say that they're not Christian, what are we actually saying? Not my responsibility.
Exactly.
Listen, if you're a white evangelical who's deconstructed or you're more progressive now, it is 1,000,000,000,000% your responsibility to deal with those people. It's not Jamar's. It's not any. It's our problem to deal with, and they are Christians.
Get your people.
Yeah. I got you. Get our people. But for real though, that's important to distinguishment.
But then it's why. What function is Christianity serving in this ideology? It's a permission structure.
Yes.
This is language I get from Freedom from Religion Foundation, a lawyer, and what it's doing is giving a divine stamp of approval on their efforts.
100%.
Saying this is what God wants. It's another crusade.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And what is their goal? The acquisition of political power and social control.
Completely.
So this is not just a sort of church thing that's going to remain behind the pulpit or in the pews.
Right.
This spills out into all of society.
This is called, in today's Christian nationalist ethos, the 7 mountain mandate.
Yeah.
Right? There are
that's a big part of
7
it.
mountains of cultural influence. A couple of them are like, it's culture, education, the government, business, the arts, family, and there's one more. I always forget it. My point is that there are people, Lance Wallnau, he's the person who made this popular. But the belief is that they have a divine calling to take over these 7 mountains of influence, to then rule over the culture, to make it Christian again, and not Christian in liberate the oppressed and forgive dead and
Not
heal
that
the
kind
sick.
of
No,
Christian.
not that kind. It is the what you just said. It comes with all of the whiteness, the white baggage of hierarchy and gender norms and racial norms and how you assimilate into them. That's what this is about.
That's right.
And it's so important to recognize.
That's right. Yeah. So I think you nailed it. And they're going to use Christian language, Christian symbolism, to say this is God's way. This is what we're, So the 7 mountains is the idea that if Christians are on top of these, sort of cultural, political, whatever mountains, then their ideas will flow down to the rest of the people.
That's right.
On the mountain and in the valley, right?
That's right.
And so you're going to have, I'm sure, Matthew D. Taylor on. He's a scholar.
I love Matthew
and
Taylor.
His forthcoming book is The Violent Take It by Force.
I cannot wait.
It's such a good contribution. And again, another scholar, right, who's marshaled actual evidence from primary resources. What he does is inject the Pentecostal element here. And this is how we get some people of color caught up in white Christian nationalist ideology, because it's coming to them through their Pentecostal churches, many
Yes.
of which are
Yes.
primarily Latino or Spanish speaking.
Yep.
Some of them are black churches, etc. This is how you get back to white people, but this is how you get a Paula White on Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board.
Right.
And by the way, Paula White's heavily influenced by black Pentecostalism. So that is something that journalists, if you're listening,
Yes.
this is what we need to get into. These are some of the nuances around what you're seeing politically and how it's rooted in a religious white Christian nationalist ideology.
I completely agree. I'm a huge fan of Matthew Taylor. He's been on the podcast many times.
Great.
We'll get him back on. Let's take a short break. When we come back, what I want to do, Jamar, is I want to then say, okay, that's one way of being Christian. What's the other way of being Christian that you've been thinking about? And how does it tie into some of the stories you tell in this book? So we'll take a break and we'll come right back. Friends, I hope you're enjoying this video. The New Evangelicals is a non-profit organization. If you want to support the work that we do, donating is the most direct way to make an impact as we hold space for folks marginalized by the evangelical church, advocate for accountability in the church, and help people like you find a better path in your faith. You can make a donation at the link in the description. All donations made in the U.S. are tax deductible. We cannot thank you enough for your generosity. It is the reason we're able to make all of this content. All right, so one of the reasons why I was like, Jamar, we have to talk, especially in studio. A, it's just more fun to talk in studio.
It sure is.
But
Better food, too.
that's true. Excuse me. A lot of people that are deconstructing, I talk to a lot of them. I'm one of the people who have renegotiated my faith, right? And 2016, 2020, the COVID all played a part in that. But one of the problems is that I think a lot of us don't know where to end up or what direction we can go in. A lot of people who renegotiate their faith end up just kind of losing it. They say, you know what, it's not for me anymore. I'm kind of done with the Christian thing. And given the expression of Christianity that we grew up in, I understand that. I do. I get that. But one thing I've noticed, having the privilege of interviewing so many amazing people and scholars, is that there's actually quite a wide array or ways of being Christian,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so what's interesting about this book, The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance, is that you're talking about people who were motivated by their faith to be agents of resistance in the face of racial injustice, right? Talk to me about why this book, and then I want to kind of get into some of the stories that you picked up and maybe what we can learn from that going forward.
So, I don't know. I guess I grew up in an environment that was racially and ethnically diverse. So that was just normal to me. And it wasn't just the visual diversity. It was the cultural diversity. So I grew up around Spanish speakers. I grew up around a rainbow of folks from racial and ethnic. So I've always not only been accustomed to it, I valued it. Not as well as I should, all that stuff. But it never seemed to me like something to be afraid of. It was something to be curious about. I think it still somewhat baffles me why that's not more often the case with many Christians. So that when we encounter a believer who believes differently, even just stylistically, so often the response is, that's wrong. You're not doing it right. Rather than, tell me why you do it that way.
Right.
I'm really interested to know.
Approaching with curiosity instead of judgment.
One of my most poignant articles on my Substack was brought on by a conversation I had with a friend of mine who's actually Jewish but has worked in the Christian filmmaking industry. And so he has this bit of an outsider's perspective on all of this stuff. And he described many white evangelicals as the people who don't have any questions. That stuck with me.
Wow.
The people who don't have any questions, because
Yeah.
they've got an answer, they've got a response, they've got a box to check for everything.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on theological matters like the Trinity,
Right.
inspiration of Scripture?
Right.
Where do you stand on quote unquote social issues?
Right.
Gender, abortion, the death penalty. Whatever question you have, there's a already scripted out answer.
Yes.
And
yes.
that fundamentally means you've answered every question. There's nothing more to be curious about.
Right.
And so how can you then encounter people who are different from you in any kind of way if you feel like you've got it all figured out. That's what we're dismantling here. And that's what I'm just losing my voice trying to articulate in books like The Spirit of Justice is the white Christian nationalist way, the Reformed theology way, the white evangelical way of believing Christianity is not the only way.
Yes. So then what are some of the other options, right? Because one of the traps that people who deconstruct can fall into, and I say this as someone who has been through the experience, so I understand the temptation, is that we think that because it's new for us, it's new for everyone.
Yeah.
Like we're the first people to ever have these questions or to leave our faith tradition behind, right? In fact, there's actually a book, I have it on my desk. I think it's called, I forgot the title, but the idea is it's 5 stories of people back in like the 19th to 20th century who grew up evangelical and left it behind. Evangelical disenchantment. That's what it's called. Mm-hmm. Great read. So this is not new,
right?
Even though it feels new to me,
right?
So help me out with this. Like, what are other ways of engaging in a Jesus-centered way that looks so different than all I've ever known?
Well, first of all, what you're describing sounds a lot like colonization. It's like Europeans coming to North America. It's like, oh, we discovered these new lands that are already inhabited.
Ooh,
there are people already here.
That's
right?
a word, yeah.
So that's one part. And then
good point.
The only one I'm deeply familiar with because I studied and experienced it is the Black Christian tradition.
Okay.
Which I think is incredibly relevant because I call the Black Christian tradition the ecclesiastical rebuttal to white Christian nationalism. A lot of people are, we're finally starting to sit up and pay attention about white Christian nationalism,
right?
And describing it and saying how harmful it is. And I call it the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church today.
100%.
And okay.
Right.
But what's the alternative?
Right. We got the problem.
Right.
Now what?
So I'm just trying to shout from the rooftops, hey, over here, the Black church exists because of racism in the white church. And as a response to it, to say there's a better way. Not only is there a better way racially speaking, there's a better way politically speaking, right? There's a long political theology that Black Christians have developed in the context of disenfranchisement, voter repression, all of that stuff. So many white Christians right now are like wringing their hands because they see Trumpism and the current Republican Party, and it's this authoritarian white Christian nationalist government for the few.
Right.
And they're like, well, what do we do?
What do we do?
And it's like, well, the Black church and Black Christians have been facing this throughout our history. So you want specific examples? There's tons of them. Number one, in this book, I profile over 50 different figures, right?
Wow.
Many of them serve as elected officials or attempted to. Fannie Lou Hamer, who I mentioned before, at giving her testimony at the Democratic National, she ran for office in Mississippi, right? And she's part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, right? Like she is explicitly identifying with a political party as an outgrowth of what she believes religiously. But instead of that, of a restrictive, reductive, authoritarian style politics, her politics and that of her compatriots expands democratic participation. Can I give you one concrete contemporary example?
Hell yeah.
Okay. Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
Yes.
Is now the governor of Arkansas. She was Trump's first press secretary.
That's Mike Huckabee's daughter.
Mike Huckabee's daughter.
Yeah.
Preacher's kid.
Yes.
Southern Baptist, all of that.
Yes.
Checks all the white evangelical boxes. Checks all the white Christian nationalist boxes.
She does.
Her opponent in the gubernatorial race was a guy named Chris Jones. Black man. Got his PhD from MIT.
Wow.
And a minister. Both of them ran what I call faith-forward campaigns. They were very open and vocal about their faith and how their faith informed their policies. Okay. Now, what's the difference? Sarah Huckabee Sanders is coming with a white Christian nationalist version of a political theology. Chris Sanders is coming with a more historic Black Christian tradition of political theology. And again, the differences are stark. Huckabee Sanders wants to essentially privatize education, reduce funding, even though she wants to say she's going to be the most pro-education governor in history, right? There was controversy about the advanced placement African American Studies course in the Arkansas Department of Education.
Right.
Historically, a lack of support for social support programs. All of those things. Chris Jones comes with a completely different agenda. Both of them arguing this is because of what I believe religiously. So that's a literal head-to-head difference.
Right.
In a recent election that we can see how these things play out. And this is not strange historically. It's part of a pattern.
Well, I saw even a small example of that at the Democratic National Convention.
Yeah.
Right. Raphael Warnock. Right. I mean, that message, it was a sermon. And when he's talking about how he wants to take care of all of his children, his neighbor's children, the children everywhere. And you're like, yes. Yeah. And again, motivated by faith,
right?
Motivated by love for Jesus, for the scriptures, for the tradition of Christian thinking, right?
I mean, yeah.
And then you compare or contrast that to someone like a Charlie Kirk or whoever on the RNC, also motivated by faith, but with very different outcomes.
So I think what'll be interesting is if you can ever pin down a Charlie Kirk and say, well, what about the faith of a Raphael Warnock or a Fannie Lou Hamer or any really, because here's the thing, demographically, Black people overwhelmingly vote Democratic and are the most religious demographic group in the country. So, and overwhelmingly identify as Christian. So I am challenging the you can't be a Christian and vote Democratic crowd.
Right.
To answer the question, well, what about all these Black Christians voting Democratic?
Right.
Are you saying that the vast majority of Black Christians are not in fact Christian?
Right. Right. Well, so you read my mind. I was going to ask you. So when you hear that, which it's said often, right? You can't be pro-choice and be a Christian.
Yeah, you can't vote for the baby killers.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Do you hear like just straight up racial overtones in that? Like, oh, like you're actually dog whistling.
It's racial overtones and undertones in two ways. One is the overt racism of this theological arrogance. Like Black people just aren't savvy enough to understand what's going on here.
Right.
They've all been duped. We've all been hoodwinked. We've all been brainwashed by the Democratic establishment. Right. So that's one thing where racism, how it expresses it. Another way that racism expresses itself is ignorance. Complete, utter, don't even think about Black people in the equation. That is what I see happening more often, even in, it's another topic, this deconstruction movement, right? So for a lot of white people, deconstructing, the alternatives are white Christian nationalism, atheism. Maybe they're trying to reconstruct and stay in the faith, but it's something they're sort of doing independently or with a small group of people. But without reference to the historic Black Christian tradition.
Completely.
So I'm like, there are ways you can unintentionally replicate the white theological arrogance of white Christian nationalism by simply not even considering the Black church and its teachings and traditions as an option you should think about.
Where does the Black church in America get its start? I mean, we're in Philadelphia, I believe one of the oldest, if not the oldest, right?
Mother Bethel.
Yes, AME is the term, right? I think it started here. Yep. What's the history there?
So the African Methodist Episcopal Church is the oldest continuously operating historic Black denomination. There were fits and starts before that. Richard Allen was the first bishop of it in the 18 teens. But the Mother Bethel was started in the 1790s. And that, so one of the things I say in The Color of Compromise is there would be no Black church without racism in the white church, which is to say it wasn't some deep theological divide over the Trinity or, inspiration of Scripture that separated the church. It was the simple fact that Black people didn't want to be treated as second-class citizens in the household of God.
Okay, pause. I want to just point this out for the audience. What you're saying is, unlike the liberal-conservative divide, right, where there were major issues around scripture, inerrancy, whatever, other theological claims, maybe the atonement. This is not why the Black church is born. Right. Not out of those kinds of issues. They hold to those. That's right. This is about racial injustice happening.
Yeah. On paper, they would check all the same boxes theologically.
That's important.
So what happened was, in the case of the AME church, Richard Allen writes about this later, but they're going to St. George's Episcopal Church, I believe, and it's a predominantly white church that has allowed black people to be now allowed. Part of it is control because you cannot have black people getting together independently. We might plot a revolt, right?
Right.
So part of this is a paternalistic supervision of black people. Nevertheless, the power of the gospel is such that, black people were authentically coming to faith, believing in Jesus, following the path, right? So it's in this context. There's been a recent church renovation, basically. And the black people come into church that Sunday, go to sit where they always sit. And without their knowledge, it has become a white section of the church. And so they're literally in prayer, kneeling in prayer. And one of the deacons of the church basically comes up and says, "You got to get up now." And black people are so reasonable. They're like, "Okay, we will, but let's finish the prayer." And the deacon's like, "No, get up now or I'm going to call more people to come over and help." And they end up finishing the prayer. But as soon as they do, they walk out of that church and they said, "Well, we never troubled them again." And they go down the street and they start what eventually becomes Mother Bethel AME Church.
Right here.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that is the racism in the white church that birthed many of the historic black Christian traditions.
Just soaking that in. I mean, that, again, the history you never learn about, right? Unbelievable.
And by the way, the history, I want to press for people. You see these ruptures in the church long before they hit the broader society. So Civil War starts 1861. Methodists and Baptists split over the issue of slavery in the 1840s. Presbyterians are always slow and deliberate. They split in the early 1860s. But you see these ruptures in the church along racial lines, along the lines of what are we going to do about slavery before the outbreak of the Civil War. So now you want to know what's going to come politically. Look at what's happening in churches and Christian spaces right now along the lines of race and justice.
So the black church gets its start out of this racist, unjust scenario.
Yeah, so the AME is long before, but then most historic black church denominations, they get their start after the Civil War and emancipation. Now they don't have to be under the thumb of white Christian churches and leaders, and they're like, great, we can finally do our own thing. So it's more around the 1860s, 70s, National Baptist Convention, which is the largest black denomination in the country, that forms from three different smaller denominations coming together in the 1890s. One of the guys on the cover of The Spirit of Justice is Reverend E.C. Morris, Elias Camp Morris. He's the first president of the National Baptist Convention. They elect him in 1895. He's president until his death in 1922. He holds a special place in my heart because I used to live in the Mississippi Delta. By the way, the Delta is not just Mississippi. It's the flood plains along both sides of the Mississippi River. So it includes parts of Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana. So I was in the Mississippi Delta on the Arkansas side, and I lived in Helena, Arkansas, which is the very town that Elias Camp Morris pastored his church, Centennial Baptist Church, which was the de facto headquarters of the largest black denomination in the country. It was right there in the little town in Arkansas in the Delta.
Did you use the term black church? I've used that term before. That can hint unintentionally that this is monolithic. It's just the black church, right? And just like how we would say the white church is way more than just the white church. There's more going on. Same thing with the black church. Like, do they start splintering over theological differences at some point?
Yeah, there's a lot. So National Baptist Convention, for instance, splits again in the 19-teens over control of the Sunday school board, which sounds minor with Sunday school, but it's really the educational arm of it, right? And so the National Baptist Convention of America forms as a result of that. And so there's the NBC USA and there's the NBCA. And those have split, right? And then in the 1960s, the president of the National Baptist Convention, again, the largest black Christian denomination in the country, the president is Joseph H. Jackson, who's conservative by some measures. He doesn't want to get involved in direct action, nonviolent protest, and doesn't let his denomination officially get involved in the civil rights movement, basically. King and Daddy King are both in the NBC. So Joseph H. Jackson has real issues with Martin Luther King Jr. because he's marching and protesting and boycotting and all these things.
He's loud.
Yeah, and he thinks, the church, that's not the church's role, or that's not the right strategy, right? So it's not so simple as he was a sellout. Joseph H. Jackson is not a sellout per se.
Okay.
But he's taking a different approach. That is much more conciliatory to the white power structure. Is basically like the way to get ahead is to get along with white people, right? Don't do all this stuff to confront them.
Right.
So then we're talking about split and diversity within the black church, right? So in the early 1960s, they split again and formed the Progressive National Baptist Convention. Progressive National Baptist Convention is king and about 200 ministers in their churches who say, we want to be more actively involved in the civil rights movement, in justice causes. So there's all these splinters and, factions and politicking, just like any other branch of the church.
They're human beings, right? I mean,
but I will say,
any of this.
In their approaches to race in general and justice in general, there's a pretty consistent voice across denominations, traditions, and decades, which is why I think we can speak of a black church political theology kind of a thing. Again, there's always diversity in there, but by and large, there's been consistency about, racism is an issue. It's not just an individual issue. It's a systemic issue, which is what white evangelicals really struggle to wrap their heads
They have like an
around.
allergy towards that word,
Exactly.
systemic
racism, right?
Right.
And they've been somewhat univocal on those kinds of issues.
Well, what is like what is that black theology politic? Like, what are we actually looking at here?
It's very pragmatic, dude. It's so clear-eyed and refreshingly realistic. There has never been a political white savior for black people. There've never really been great options in a binary Democratic Republican electoral system, right? So black people have always understood no candidate is going to perfectly represent me or my community or my interests, but we've got to elect people we can work with. We got to elect people who we can perhaps persuade and push. And it actually has been even simpler than that. We got to elect the party that is not actively playing on white supremacy.
Yeah.
I mean, in the first election after the Civil War, the phrase of the opposing party was, "This is a white man's country, let white men rule." You don't have a hard choice that election if you're black, if you can even vote, right? So So I think now white people and white Christians in particular are finally realizing that since the rise of the religious right in the past 40 plus years, they've been discipled into a type of political theology that is this largely one issue voting on the topic of abortion without considering all the interconnected issues that actually lead to an increase in abortions. And we were talking the other day, abortions actually go down under Democratic presidents.
Look at the data.
Not because they're Democratic, but because they're supporting social support systems. That make it easier to have kids, right?
Access to contraceptives, better sex ed, things like that, right?
You got it. So white Christians are finally waking up to the fact that they've been discipled into this one particular way of thinking about faith and politics, but now they're faced with this really almost unconscionable choice with Trump. But they've been in this, soup of teaching about politics for so long that it's like this gag reflex of voting for a Democrat who they call, baby killers and, pro-abortion and all this stuff. But in trying to maneuver and navigate that tension, if you will, that new experience of feeling like you can't vote for the Republican candidate, which has always been promoted to you as the only Christian way to vote, look at the black Christian political tradition for some guidance.
And to be clear, like you said, there are many, I think that one of the misnomers, and I think for a long time I believed this, and I'm trying to still get more out of that binary, is that if I ever vote more Democratic, all of that liberal theology comes along with it. So I lose a physical resurrection. I lose any kind of sense of the Bible being authoritative, whatever. What I hear you saying is actually, no. In fact, maybe we could even say that taking the Bible very seriously and authoritative can actually make a robust argument why you would find some space in democratic politics.
Look at that.
Am I putting the pieces together here?
Yeah. It sounds like it making sense.
Yeah.
But here's the thing too. White Christians have a tradition of democratic voting as well.
Yeah, right.
I mean,
Right.
you look at Tim Walz is a fascinating religious example
Who?
of
Sorry?
Tim Walz, vice president.
Oh, yes.
candidate. Fascinating. Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, ELCA.
Right.
The more progressive wing as compared to LCMS, Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and a typical white bread Midwestern Christian.
Right.
He actually represents a pretty long tradition of white Christians who, because of their faith, chose to vote more democratic in the past, since mid 20th century-ish kind of a thing. So there's actually, white people don't just have to look at the black church, please do, but there are other white Christians who, because they were Christian, chose to vote a different way. And here's my thing. I'm not saying your salvation depends on who you vote for.
Right.
Which is what the right is saying.
Oh my gosh.
If you vote for
I
a
know.
Democrat, you are not Christian, which is
Wow.
why I challenge you to say, well, what do you do with all the black Christians voting Democratic?
Right.
Are you really willing to say,
Right.
we're not Christian or whatever?
Right.
But also, in addition to looking at the black political theology and tradition, there is a white, mostly mainline Christian tradition that has similar political values.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's wacky because when you really think about it, if you just read, let's just start with the words of Jesus. If you just take the Sermon on the Mount.
Hold on,
and
you're bringing Jesus into
I
this
know,
conversation
I know.
about Christianity?
I'm not starting with Paul. I'm starting with Jesus. I know it's crazy. As a Jesus follower, I'm starting with Jesus. But obviously, look, Jesus did not grow up in any kind of republic or democracy. He was not able to vote. There was no such thing as voting for his life. We understand that, right? So we read the teachings and we go, okay, there's obviously yes, of course, there's an individual application to this, but also as a citizen in this country, how do these teachings inform how I think about my political engagement? That's a very fair question. And if you do that and you read the Sermon on the Mount, you would just have a hard time trying to fit some of these, at least concepts, into Project 2025. Oh, yeah.
Into
whatever Trump says from the stage. And you would just have a hard time doing that. I'm not saying it's a shoo-in for every single Democratic policy out there,
Exactly.
No, but there seems to be an air of at least we're willing to think about how we take care of all of our neighbors, or at least we're willing to give those who have fallen through the cracks a seat at the table. That's the stuff for me. I'm like, how do you read the Sermon on the Mount and think, yes, we need more guns, less access to healthcare, and if you're poor, you probably deserve it. Just work harder.
Yeah.
It doesn't add up.
That's more American and Western
Yes.
individualism than it is the way of Jesus.
I think so. Right.
So I wanted to read a quote by Frederick Douglass. So what's so great about Frederick Douglass? He has no time for the BS.
I love that.
He goes right for the jugular. So he's responding to this letter from somebody who's asking him about the colored question in the language of the day and voting. And Douglass responds in a letter that was published in a newspaper, and he says basically that it makes absolutely zero sense to support the party that is supporting your oppression racially. And he says, I cannot see, he says, for the life of me, I cannot see how any honest colored man who has brains enough to put two ideas together can allow himself under the notion of independence to give aid and comfort to the other party, right? So he's like, I just love the way you
Right.
anybody who can put two ideas together can
Right.
see this.
Like,
but
use
then he
your
goes
brain.
on to say, he's independent, but he's independent within the party that he promotes. So he says, my advice to colored men everywhere is stick to the party of freedom, but tell your wants. Hold the party up to its profession. Nevertheless, do your utmost to keep it in power in state and nation.
Wow. Powerful, because being at the DNC,
1883, by the way.
being at the DNC, I saw elements of that, right? And this is not a one-for-one by any means, but I'm thinking about the uncommitted movement who was there, the Palestinian Americans who were there, who were saying, listen, we're part of the party. We love the party, but also we're trying to get a voice inside the party, right? And I'm like, ooh, I hear some echoes of that sentiment,
Exactly.
of what Frederick Douglass says in that quote,
Yeah.
happening still today.
Because the accusations are the same.
Yeah.
The accusations are this Frederick Douglass guy, he's been brainwashed. He's not thinking for himself. He's leading people astray. He's being divisive. If people were truly independent thinkers, they would vote for the other party, right? So Douglas is arguing back, I am an independent thinker, but I'm also not blind.
Right.
Like, I see what each party is standing for, what it means in particular for Black people, but also women, poor people, any kind of marginalized group you can think of. And I'm sticking with the party that is at least giving lip service to progress.
Right.
And as they do, I'm going to hold them accountable to an even higher standard. So I'm going to be that, voice within the party that says, but what about this? And can we do
the
that?
Squeaky
and
wheel.
You said you would do this.
Right. Yeah.
I think you can be a Democrat or a Republican today with that attitude and be helpful to each party and to democracy in general.
I 100% agree. And I truly believe, especially if we're going to claim allegiance to the way of Jesus, we have an obligation in any power structure we find ourselves to always be thinking about who's falling through those cracks. What's our obligation to be that squeaky wheel for the sake of all of our neighbors, And I think it's both and, right? Like, obviously, dude, listen, being at the convention, I was thinking to myself, there's a lot of money here. There's a lot of power here. There was a lot of talk about the military here. I'm like, okay. I have critiques of empire as a Jesus person.
Yep.
I'm not a fan that we are the world's largest exporter of arms all across the world.
Yep.
I also understand that this particular party is so big that there are a lot of voices helping to be the change for a better path forward, right? So it's that both and of, I see the power, I see the money, I see the empire that's still here. However, I also see who else is in this party, and then how can I help be an advocate for those voices as we push for a better path for all of us, right? Yeah. That's the both and here. It's not a sycophantic idolization of anyone in that party of like, oh my God, they're going to save America. They're going to bring back all of the things I think need to happen. No, they're human beings. They're flawed. They're not perfect. I get that. All the more reason to hold them accountable because I believe that ultimately we can accomplish what we need to do if we're willing to work together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Tim, like, what's the difference? I mean, if you can pinpoint, you're somebody who came out of a lot of these backgrounds, more conservative, more right-leaning, especially politically. The light bulb seems to have come on for you.
Yeah.
Someone in your position with a similar background, and it hasn't come on for them. I mean, can you talk any of the factors that led to you moving in this direction and them kind of staying on that course?
I wrestle with this a lot because, and your own perspective is always a little bit skewed of how you think about yourself compared to how folks perceive you.
I'll tell you how I perceive you. No,
I told you straight. For me, even starting TNE, everything I've always done in my life has always been through the lens of how do I be the best Jesus follower as best as I know how at any given point based on what I know. Even when I remember being 19 and meeting my first ever gay person. He was a coworker with me at Starbucks. He's actually in my book. I wrote about him. And he blew away all the categories that I was told about gay people, right? Now, at the time, I was still very conservative. I thought being gay was sinful, all the stuff. But I recognized early, I'm like, though, my tradition seems to be really loud towards these particular people, but not towards other quote unquote sins in the Bible. We're not really critiquing the greed of America or like, it's always about the gay people. Where's that coming from?
Right.
So I think one of the big differences between maybe me who has moved on and others who have stayed or even went in the farther right direction is what we talked about earlier. I was always curious. I was always like, okay, there's a perspective I'm not seeing. Dude, I remember this was one of the biggest epiphanies I ever had. You're going to laugh when I tell you. But I was working on a job site. I was painting walls. I had to be like 16 or 17 and someone's dad or something. They had talk radio on. Now I grew up on a steady diet of Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, all those guys. We're like year 5 or 6 into Obama's overall presidency. Wow. And I'm mad at what I missed because I was so indoctrinated by that. Like I didn't realize the Obama years and what I was actually a part of, Anyway, I'm rolling a wall and it hits me. I'm like, for the past 6 years, Rush Limbaugh has never said one positive thing or one accomplishment about the Obama administration. Not one. Yet we're all still here. The country's still going. I still have a life. America has not been destroyed. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no way he can only be this bad.
Right.
because we're all still here. Like we're all functioning. And that was, I mean, I literally was just, I was rolling a wall, man. I hate painting. That's why I don't do it anymore. I'm painting a wall and I'm thinking to myself, I wonder how that works. Like, what is it that for the past 6 years, I've never heard a positive, even like, you know, like Obama's fatherhood initiative.
Right.
I was like, wait, I learned about that later on. Like, wait, why did talk radio never celebrate that? Aren't they all about fatherhood and pro-family? So there were little moments like that where I thought, I gotta be missing a perspective. Right. And so I think over time, taking that along with my commitment to being a radical allegiance to Jesus person, I think eventually I thought to myself, this path I'm on feels very untenable with the way of Jesus. Yeah. You know, I often say that one of the biggest differences between the Christian nationalism and whatever other, we can use the black church in this example, or other kinds of Christian expressions, is that Jesus teaches us to bear a cross for our enemies, and Christian nationalism wants to build crosses for theirs.
Ooh.
Right? Poetic. And I'm like, yeah, okay, which one's more faithful to Jesus? So I just think for me, even this work, I think I'm more consistent with the way of Jesus. But there are friends of mine, and I love and I respect them. I've known them my whole life. The relationship is there. They've either stayed or they drifted farther. I'm like, I think that you're actually just kind of embracing a dogmatic understanding of these things, and you're not willing to actually critically interrogate them. Right. And it leads you down a very bizarre path where you really think that if we have less gun control, that's the Christian path forward. That you still think that the reason why black people are more poor is because they don't work hard enough. I'm like, think about, critically examine that statement. What are you actually saying? Are you saying that there's some kind of genetic difference? Right. That there's something deeper? You know, that there's some kind of inferiority? Well, history tells me what kind of people were using that language back then. Right?
Yeah.
So I just think that's how I kind of got there. And I think the biggest difference is that curiosity approach.
I do think curiosity is key. And then what happens with that curiosity?
I agree.
I feel like at some point, a lot of people come to that point of question, does this make sense?
Yeah.
But then you either choose to pull on that thread of curiosity and be willing to have some of your ideas challenged or even changed.
Right.
Or you don't. And here's the kicker. You don't just stay the same. You actually get more, you hold those ideas, that ideology more strongly. So you actually it actually gets harder to persuade or convince you.
Yes.
Because you've made a decision at that point.
Yes.
You're sticking with this thing and you're going to hold on to it even tighter as it gets challenged, as people question it.
In a bizarre way, it's bizarre to say now, but it still makes sense to me. So to me, this is completely consistent. I use a lot of my own evangelical language and upbringing. That's actually what led me to where I'm at.
Yes, right.
I mean, one key example.
What they were teaching.
Right, the idea of repentance. Right, Tim, you need to be always repenting for your sin. Key, even especially Reformed, evangelical staple. Well, and I'm not blowing smoke, Jamar. When I read your book, Color of Compromise, I went, I didn't know. I know now. As a Christian, I have an obligation to repent and to go the other way. It was totally consistent with an evangelical message, right? I didn't know about the legacy of racism that white evangelicals committed. Maybe I have some of that in my own life. I want to examine my heart, right? And then when I see that sin, I want to repent and go the other way. Yeah. So to me, all of these things were completely consistent with a pretty typical, even white evangelical message. So when I met people or friends of mine on Facebook who were like, that's liberal, that's Marxist, I'm like, no, it's biblical. Like, it's just doing what you guys taught me to do. Maybe you don't like how I'm applying it, right? Maybe you don't like what topics I'm repenting of or I'm willing to turn away from, but this idea is totally in line with my tradition.
Yeah.
And so that was another big moment for me as well.
It is. And I think we kind of overcomplicate things, right? Like, why do people get so entrenched in ideologies that seem so anti-Christian, anti-gospel?
Yeah, right.
You were talking about, even as a teenager, you had this steady diet of, right-wing talk radio.
Steady.
That's actually only increased lately, because now not only do you have radio, you have television, you have YouTube, you have social media, you have their own, chat channels and things.
Totally.
Like that. Podcasts, right?
Yep. Rumble.
I think there are so many people who are so in this ideological bubble that they are inoculated against any ideas outside of that bubble.
I tell pastors often who talk to me, I say, listen, I have bad news for you. You might think that you are discipling your congregation or that Jesus is, but Tucker Carlson is who they follow. And this is just data. Most white evangelicals consume right-wing media. That's their biggest audience. And like, you have to wake up to that. And those people are really good at planting little mines in their heads. So when they hear certain terms, climate change, climate change should be an amoral topic. It's just data. Hey, the climate is warming. There's great, strong, overwhelming evidence to suggest that we're part of the problem. How do we fix it? But for some people, it's Marxism. How do you get there? Who plants those seeds in your head, right? When you see George Floyd murdered in broad daylight, crying out for his mother, what seeds have been planted in your head to make you think that somehow he deserved it because of his criminal background? Where's the Jesus ethic in that, right? Like, again, Sermon on the Mount, where is Jesus in this? No, it's not Jesus. It's right-wing talk radio steeped in supremacy that has actually gotten a hold of the white evangelical psyche. And those talking points get disseminated through the networks that have been built through white evangelicalism since the moral majority. And this is why it's so symbiotic, right? To your point earlier, this whole world is in a bubble. They have an answer for everything, and they're not curious to examine their own biases. They think that they're holding on to some sort of objective truth while actually being the moral relativist in the room, right? Like you said earlier, every accusation sometimes is a confession. We hear all of us talk about the postmodern world and how they don't believe in truth. Who's the one? Dude, let's just speak frank. RFK is partnered with Trump now. Charlie Kirk makes that happen. They shake hands. Charlie Kirk goes, I'm so proud of this moment. We're now the unity party. RFK is an anti-vax conspiratorial maniac, right? This is not the party of unity. This is the party of conspiracies. The same party that will say we're standing on truth. What truth? There's no peer review. They ignore the science. They ignore the data. They still believe that the election was stolen. So it's a confession.
That's right.
They have actually no moral integrity. There's no moral foundation. And then they have the damn, now you got me preaching. Now you have the damn audacity to claim that you're on the side of God or that God's on your side and that the Bible is your source for, no, stop playing. Like, you are playing with me. If you think I'm supposed to believe that.
Playing in our faces, as they say. And what's so interesting is,
you got me going.
I love it. This is the truth.
Spicy Tim comes out.
Spicy Tim. What's in that cup? So what's so interesting about it is we're talking in very strong terms about the sort of right-wing ideology and the people who adhere to it. And at the same time, as we go back to, let's say, the Black church tradition, Black Christian tradition, we've been extremely patient with people who have trafficked in our dehumanization. Right? So I don't want people to listen and be like, oh, they're just bashing, the right wing or whatever. Reality is, I can go back to one of my mentors, Dr. Bill Pinnell, still alive today as we record this, 96 years old.
Wow.
He, in so many ways, is a forerunner and a precursor to someone like me. Because all the way back in the late 1960s, he writes a book called My Friend the Enemy. Bill Pinnell is an evangelist. He's a singer, and he gets he comes to faith in white Christian spaces and stays there, mostly white evangelical spaces. And so when he talks about my friend, it's about the people who he associates with, white evangelicals, who are friendly to him, platform him in a certain way, but at the same time have no idea what his reality is. So this is Black Power era, the Watts uprisings, things of that nature, Detroit uprisings, and the Black community is in turmoil. We're coming on the tail end of what we might formally call the civil rights movement, but we're also seeing that in addition to Southern racial segregation and racial terrorism, the North has its problems. Urban areas have their problems. Those are also rooted in racism, but not being addressed. And so Bill Pinnell writes this book, My Friend, who's also the enemy. Because they don't know what kind of harm they're continuing to perpetuate on Black people, especially in their midst, but also writ large. So I say that all to bring up the point that, someone like Pinnell could have just kicked the dust off his sandals and gone on to something else without a glance behind. But he writes this whole book to say, look, I'm going to be honest with you. These are some hard-hitting, painful truths, but I'm doing it because I actually love you. I want you to repent, and I want us to be unified as followers of Christ.
I want to tell you the most powerful moment I witnessed at the DNC that plays into exactly what you just said. And honestly, I really might cry telling the story because it really hit me so deeply. So we're sitting in line to get into the arena. So the way it works is like security is crazy there. So it's pretty much you're funneling 50,000 people into a small choke point. So we're in line, and there is someone in a Trump hat and like a Trump sweatshirt, and they're doing content. And there's also protesters, pro-Palestinian protesters, like some of those folks that were also there. And I watched this interaction happen where one of the protesters at first is talking to the Trump guy, tries to take his camera, spits on his feet, and then like calls him a bunch of names. And I was like, whoa, that was very intense. And behind me were two elderly black women who saw the whole thing. And they saw it and they go, did that person just spit on that Trump guy? Wow. Like, yeah. And they go, oh, no, honey. No. We don't do that. We know what that's like. And I'm sitting there, I'm just like, dude, I am in line. I want to talk to them, but they don't know who I am. And, you know, I'm wrecked. I'm like wrecked by this moment of they saw the dehumanization of that protester towards that Trump supporter. They have no obligation to even think about that person's humanity, given what that person's wearing. And they go, we've experienced being spit on. And that's why it's a no for us. And I'm just like, damn.
Yeah.
Dude, that's powerful, man.
And I would not be surprised if you did talk to them if they were church going.
They had
Christian,
their,
you know.
I'm not one to judge,
Church mamas.
but I could see them and they had the outfits on, they were wearing the hats.
Right.
And I was like, you're just beautiful people.
Yeah.
But that was a moment for me where I said, that's the kind of rehumanization I want to have my enemies too. Right? I want that Trump supporter to find a better way forward.
Yeah.
I want his supremacy to be composted.
Yeah.
Right? So he can lay ground for more fertile soil that plants more beautiful seeds for a better way forward. And spitting on him isn't going to do that. Do I understand the anger and the rage? Of course listen, I'm a white dude who is like furious at my own tradition for what we've done to people in America. I understand the rage so deeply, but you don't change his mind by doing that. And that person exists, and we're not going to kill him, obviously. He exists on the planet. He's here with us. We got to find a way.
That's right.
You know?
That's right. You're bringing up something that I talk about in the last chapter, the spirit of justice. I look at, all right, what binds these, dozens of figures together throughout history.
Yeah.
By the way, it's not a coincidence that this message came from black women, because they're at the intersections of racism and sexism, even from black men, and just have this incredibly humanizing perspective that we can all learn from.
Yeah.
So I have a whole chapter on black women of the civil rights movement in the book. But what we're seeing is this this refusal to become like your oppressor.
Yes.
And so in the last chapter of the book, I talk about the virtues that this disparate people across times and decades have in common. I talk about faith, courage, imagination, and resilience, right? And all of that to say, I think we need to change the calculus on justice. Right now, I think a lot of us evaluate the effectiveness of our justice efforts based on the changes that we make externally. What laws were passed, what policies changed, what politician was elected or defeated, right? Those are all important.
Yeah.
But I think from the standpoint of faith, what is important is not just the changes that happen in the world, but the changes that happen in you.
Yeah.
The changes that happen in those two black women you're talking about are being shaped at the soul level by Christ.
Yeah.
Right? If we're assuming they're Christian, right?
Sure.
It's about a refusal to become that which you're fighting against.
Yeah.
And I think we need to emphasize that in our current justice efforts, that it's, number one, you're going to get really discouraged if you only look at the changes in the world.
Yeah.
Because here's the reality, especially as we approach a presidential election.
Right.
We don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
Sure, there's some momentum with the Harris Walls ticket right now, but there's a lot of stuff that can happen between now and then. There's a lot of different factors, and we're playing with some folks who don't fight fair, right?
Totally.
So we don't know what's going to happen. So if it turns out your candidate loses in November, what are you going to do?
Right.
How are you going to keep going and making constructive action? So it's about perseverance, right? And by the way, November's not an end. It's the end of one thing and the beginning of another.
100%.
No matter who wins.
There's a lot of work to do.
There's a lot going on even after the election. We won't even know right away who won the election because of all the accusations of fraud and all that stuff.
Right.
So anyway, there's that. How are you going to keep going if you don't get the external changes you want? And then number two, from the standpoint of faith, we've got to understand that there is virtue in doing the right thing just for doing the right thing. Why? Not because it changes the world, but because it changes you.
Yeah.
And that's part of what keeps Black Christians going, is that they are not going to be like the people who oppress them. And by pursuing justice, they become the people of justice. They tap into the spirit of justice. And that is what changes people.
Yeah.
And that is what changes the world. And even if it doesn't change the world, it changes you. And that matters too.
This was so good. This was so good.
It was fun.
It was
conversation.
awesome. Friends,
Thank you.
the book is The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. The book is out now. Dr. Jemar Tisby, I mean, man, what a conversation. It was so good.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thank
making
you.
time.
Yeah.
We'll do it again. We got work to do no matter what.
We got a lot of work to do.
It was awesome, dude. I love it, man. Woo! Another one down, baby.
And another one down. And another one down.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, can you get a pic?
Yeah, we'll get a pic for sure.